Hey everyone, it's LS, and this is going to be another LS Logic. It's been quite a long time since I've actually done one of these. If you're unfamiliar with who I am and you're just tuning into this, I'm currently one of the color casters for the LCK, as well as a streamer, and I've also done coaching for numerous teams in the past, and I play League of Legends on the Korean server. So the topic that I wanted to talk about was mostly centered around champion balance, as well as the boring meta. And I want to talk about this in light of patch 9.14. One of the main things that really struck me odd as 9.14 hit is that it was supposed to be a really, really big patch. And it was supposed to come with a lot of changes that were supposed to be meaningful and impactful. And even though I wasn't following any of the PBE changes, I still had really high hopes for the patch. And then once it ended up dropping, I was sort of let down, even if we did get some good things out of them. And one of the really good things that we did get out of patch 9.14 is mostly what triggered me to make this video, or basically just made me say, okay, I actually need to talk about this. And it was actually Kled. It was Kled and Aatrox. And one of the things that I saw a lot of people talking about over the last few months was the Azir Corki meta. We saw lots of talks about Tom Kench and how unhealthy he was. We saw balanced talks about Riven. We saw balanced talks about Vayne. We saw balanced talks about Aatrox even, and then there was a lot of negativity about the Aatrox nerfs that I personally think are a buff, and I would implore anyone who thinks that it's not a buff to go through any competitive or high MMR Aatrox game where Aatrox enters into a fight, or how he plays around team fights or split pushes or anything like that, and pay attention to how the World Ender is actually utilized. And you'll often see that the revive isn't really all that important. It's mostly just coming down to the healing and what the World Ender passive innately gives him without actually the revive. In most cases, the revive is either going to just be luxurious and it doesn't really change or impact the fight, or he's going to die anyway, in which case the revive was just delaying the inevitable and maybe you absorb one more spell cast. And I understand that in a few situations that can end up causing the team fight to maybe go one way or another, but realistically in pro play or really high MMR, it doesn't tend to be that way. So a lot of people were up in arms about Aatrox. Well, when 9.14 actually came out, we saw Kled, who now has a superior version of Grievous Wounds, basically. He essentially got a free item gifted into his kit, in the sense that he now has the reduction on healing, which is normally something that Kled would have to itemize in order to purchase. But then, in addition to that, he got it on sort of steroids because of how effective it is with his kit and how good it is against a lot of the current meta champions. The thing about Kled that is so interesting is that Kled in himself negates and contains Aatrox in many ways. Aatrox was a menace in the top lane, and a lot of professional teams were picking Aatrox. They were picking Jace, they were picking Karma, they're picking all these weird champions up in top lane, and all of the champions aren't really that overpowered, but they just tend to do a little bit more than every other champion can offer, and they suck less, is how I basically view it. And even when Aatrox was getting picked a ton, I never thought he was really that OP. I think that teams around the world, as well as high MMR even, weren't being very creative with champion picks and team compositions and drafting in ways that Aatrox would not be a viable champion pick. Champions such as Kindred, such as Zillion, or heavy CC team compositions, or team compositions that have extremely heavy forms of engage or stationary disengage. And what I mean by that is something like Zyra, where the Zyra ultimate can actually come out and allow certain damage dealers to deal lots of damage, all the while denying an engage attempt. And Aatrox got to sort of reign free because the way that teams basically pick and draft around the world is very copy-paste, with the exception of a few teams. And the few teams are really interesting because they really challenge the meta, and they put to the test how effective really is the meta, as well as how effective really are the players that are trying to pilot the champions that are occurring inside of this meta. And so this got me to thinking that I've been very vocal ever since I've been doing patch rundowns that I'm very for imbalance versus imbalance rather than nerfing everything. And so I made a list of things that I think most people will remember. Everyone remembers Camille being really, really strong. And everyone remembers that Camille was not necessarily fun to play against when you were playing a champion that wasn't designed to fight Camille. And so there was a lot of bans that had to be allocated towards these really, really strong champions. I remember, for instance, the LeBlanc Rengar Camille meta. But there were still champions that could go up against Camille, and they could even beat her, most notably Fiora and Jax. And so because those champions existed, sometimes these champions, like Camille, had to play a balancing act where they could be picked, but they had to really fit the mold of the team composition, or they had to make sure that the Fiora or the Jax didn't fit the mold of the enemy team composition if they were going to upfront go with Camille. As the game continues to evolve and teams start to get better, concepts like this in draft order, draft pick timings, and being able to skew the way that the opponents can actually draft in response to your picks, as well as proactively, is something that's going to most likely inevitably happen, because we see it in card games, we see it in other video games. And even if it's not happening all that much in League of Legends, it doesn't mean that it can't exist. So rather than Camille getting nerfed in that state, other champions could have been buffed to simply match her and make her afraid. And then if that ends up happening, Camille doesn't actually need to get nerfed, because then suddenly people stop complaining about Camille because they're met with the response, well, just pick this, or just pick that, or just pick this. And if there's enough of those type of answers, or if there's enough champions that exist within the meta to actually handle Camille on a team composition level, then even if Camille has an advantageous matchup in the top lane, it doesn't necessarily mean that her advantage translates well to the 5v5, no matter how strong she might end up getting. Right now in the meta, we see something like Azir and Corki. We see a lane where neither player can really do anything, and we just experience this scaling for 15-20 minutes. It's basically losing lanes are forced to play against each other for 20 minutes, and then a team fight happens. In addition to this, we've seen champions like Ezreal, Sivir, we've seen Kai'Sa, we've seen Tahm Kench in the bottom lane. All of these champions are not really that oppressive, they just tend to not suck. And because they don't suck, and because they're so stable, they can get away and they can coast by. And at the pro level, that sort of is all that's necessary, especially for players that might be better than their opponents, because now you have these safety champions that, even if they're not really that strong when they get an item advantage inside of the lane, or they get half an item advantage inside of the lane, or at specific points of the game with 2 to 3 items, they're just offering more than certain other champions, even if they still themselves don't really feel that strong. And so then what you end up seeing happen is you see the meta sort of devolve. You start to see players start picking random champions. In Korea, for instance, Taliyah has returned to the mid lane, even though Taliyah has received lots of changes, and Taliyah at one point in time attempted to return to the mid lane, but wasn't really having the best of times. Taliyah's sort of been all over the place. She ended up as a support with the Avengers bot lane, Pantheon Taliyah. She was a jungler for a while, and now she's back to being basically a mid laner in the LCK, with the ability to go jungle if an AP jungler is somehow necessary, even if that doesn't tend to be the case. We also have the return of champions that have pretty much only been nerfed or had really big problems against other champions in the past. Primarily, I'm referring to Kennen, Gangplank, and Camille up in top lane, as well as Gnar and even Tahm Kench. These are all champions that they have clear-cut weaknesses. They have clear conditions that can exist so that they can't really be viable, or they can't do the things that they want to do. The problem is when no one's doing anything, suddenly these champions are allowed to exist in their current state. When the strongest champions in the game cannot bully these champions enough or in a way that they should bully them, they can exist even inside of counter matchups, which is actually something that I wanted to refer to in the Lissandra meta. Back when Lissandra was dominating everything a couple of months ago, Lissandra shouldn't have been able to beat certain champions. She shouldn't have been able to beat Orianna. She shouldn't have been able to beat Zoe. She shouldn't have been able to beat long-range poke mages of basically any kind. Any champion that could just throw themselves at her, she shouldn't have been able to beat. And a lot of people will attest this to Aftershock. But rather than buffing the champions that can harm Lissandra and can make her afraid from being picked or just arbitrarily selected at some point inside of the draft, instead Lissandra received nerfs. And the first nerf didn't really hit her. And then the nerf to her cooldown, she didn't show up again until MSI. And she shows up again at MSI because it seems like people ran out of ideas. Because then, once the splits resumed, Lissandra didn't really show herself all that much. We see this with a lot of other champions inside of the game. Most notably was the return of Tahm Kench when most people thought that he was dead after a set of nerfs. In fact, Riot crippled his ability to jungle at one point by reducing the ultimate range, although I've been told many times now that he's still able to play support and his jungle was actually buffed. I have yet to personally go and see that myself, and no one actually picked him in competitive, at least in the jungle role, outside of Malice against APK in Korea Challenger Series. He was picked 2 times during the playoffs match, BBQ versus APK. One of the results ended up in a win, and then another one was a loss for Sir Thomas Kench. But it didn't mean that Tom couldn't exist at that point in time, but it really went to show that people were uncomfortable or unwilling to pick other champions or try to break away from the meta because of a fundamental flaw that the meta has in itself right now. And then people are also really quick to jump on placebos, and one of the most recent ones is actually Karma, where Karma got buffed, and suddenly everyone was picking her, and she was able to go everywhere. Then Karma got brought back down, and still, when I talked to several pro players, they said, oh, Karma's just still really good, she's really OP, which suggests that Karma was always really good. But when people suggested that Karma could have been good months ago, they were let with laughter, or they were told that there was just other champions that did what she did, but better, and that they were more safe or less risky. But the reality is that Karma tends to suck less than most other champions. If all of a sudden you can reach the mid to end game stage and you press RE on several teammates, you suddenly basically granted your teammates 7 versus 5 temporarily during the shield activation. And so she comes with her own little nuance where she can get through laning phase. She has different rune flexibility that allows her to play out various matchups in different styles and manners. And then she also has a lot of interesting itemization paths that she can pivot into depending on what the game state is, which is really, really cool and very interactive for a champion. But throughout time, Riot has nerfed champions rather than buffed them. We saw it very often. In fact, we saw it with Quinn. Quinn was dominating top lane at one point, and Quinn got gutted rather than the champions that gave Quinn a problem being buffed. We saw it with Hecarim Top. Hecarim Top was not really actually that good, but because he sucked less than other champions, because he beat all the nerf champions, Hecarim existed in the top lane. The same was also true for Yorick for a brief period of time, but the reality of the situation is that the champion wasn't all that good. So then you go on to other champions that keep getting nerfed, or they keep getting changed, Victor being the most notable. Victor Iceborne Gauntlet didn't really do a lot of damage. The thing about Victor was that he utilized Kleptomancy really well, he utilized the mana items from it really well, and he utilized the gold acceleration very well due to the fundamental nature of his kit and his base scaling. There were champions that could still beat Victor. He wasn't just a I go up against everyone kind of champion, or he would try, but there were still champions that could match him. Most notably were mages. Mages could actually take it to Victor and make him feel somewhat afraid. And so because of that, there was a limited amount of champions that could rise up to oppose him. And rather than learning those champions or increasing the number of such champions, instead Victor got hit gradually, and also other types of Victor ended up getting hit. Then there was a brief period of time where everything just sort of settled, and the meta became stable, but everything really sucked. There wasn't a lot of damage, everything became slower, and champions didn't tend to have really flashy interactive gameplay with the type of pivots that I ended up mentioning just a little bit earlier. So because of this, Victor gets cast by the wayside. And then suddenly, champions that aren't getting nerfed slowly rise back up, even after maybe they had been nerfed previously. And then in addition to this, champions that are even maybe considered grossly overpowered, such as Akali, were still able to be kept in check by other champions at certain points in their reign of dominance, such as Galio. I remember that most Korean players would say that, well, you can't pick Akali unless Galio is banned. Galio would single-handedly contain her, the same way that Kled can single-handedly contain Aatrox right now. And Kled doesn't need to be the only champion to contain Aatrox. There's other types of champions that can certainly contain Aatrox and can beat him. One of the ones during spring was actually Gangplank, could beat Aatrox and make him feel afraid. Another thing about Gangplank is that realistically, if Jace is banned away and Kennen is banned away, but you can play around Kennen, mostly it's just Jace, Gangplank is potentially the best top laner in the game because he scales so well, and he has an ultimate that is game-changing and impactful, and he has a lot of ways to suck less than other players, as well as ways to have those type of itemization pivots that I already alluded to. And so a champion ends up rising from the grave as a byproduct of things around him falling. And some people might say, well, this is actually what ends up happening in a meta. But when the trend is always just nerf, 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 you're not really getting power, you're just getting things that suck less. And so there's other examples of this, such as Sejuani. Sejuani isn't really that good, even though she's the S+ jungler right now, or she's considered to be an S+ jungle. And the reason that she's an S+ jungle is because anti-tanks aren't super strong right now. But then in addition to that, champions that are particularly good against her style of engage are not really that good right now. But there's other champions that exist right now that are good with her, and because champions can't bully her enough due to changes that occurred around the map, suddenly a champion that sucks becomes okay. But if you then enter a potential meta where everything is strong, suddenly the drafts become a lot more interactive, but then there's less complaints about the champions, rather the complaints start becoming, don't whine about X, Y, and Z, instead do this. For instance, if Aatrox has 5 to 6 potential containers in terms of champions, one of them being Kled, or another one being Rise, or let's say that Jace ends up getting buffed again, and Jace can help contain Aatrox. Suddenly, you can't blind pick Aatrox. If other junglers like Kindred, or other champions like Zyra, or champions like Zillion end up getting buffed, this provides flexibility throughout a draft phase that allows people to answer Aatrox early, even if the Aatrox team attempts to ban out the Aatrox containers. In addition to this, you can sort of see an example of what powerful champions can do, but typically when we have really powerful champions, they come from one role, not many. An example of this would be Season 6 Jungle. Nidalee and Graves were really strong. Suddenly, Red Smite made you Neo from the Matrix. Nidalee would show up with one item and be able to delete your entire HP bar. But the jungle champions were really, really, really strong, and there were a few mid laners that were strong, but there was definitely a gross discrepancy in power between the roles. And the answer to this was to nerf the champions that were really strong rather than build up the champions around them and then nerf in one fell swoop or something like a cutting knife or something, so that you can hit everything at once rather than have these spikes and things tend to occur. And so one of the things that it got me thinking of, and I talked about it with a few pro players, is imagine Karthus 7 months ago, pre-R nerf, when he was clearing the jungle instantly, when we first picked him, or BBQ, I'm no longer with BBQ, first picked him at Kespa Cup. And the Korean reaction was that if it worked, BBQ was genius, and if it failed, then it just made no sense. But that's not how you really review things in the first place anyway. Anyways, the Karthus ended up showing up really big. For the next 6 months, Karthus basically wouldn't get picked in the LCK. In Challenger Series Korea, Karthus was 100% pick and ban against Malice, and anytime he got Karthus, he won. So Karthus was an interesting thing, because it suggested that all of these teams were willing to ban him, acknowledging the power of this jungler, but not bother to learn him themselves, even though Karthus would go on to dominate solo queue regions across the world and even ended up being picked up in Europe. What I would want to talk about now is what happens if you take 7-month-old Karthus and you throw him into Season 6. all of a sudden Graves and Italy have someone new to fear. And then in addition to that, Karthus, who doesn't really fear that many things right now, he's actually afraid. If you then throw in the strong Akali and the strong Galio, and you throw in all the other strong champions when they were really powerful, such as Aatrox, or such as Victor, or such as Jace, or such as Lucian when he was really strong, or you end up buffing Caitlyn. These junglers, even when they're fed, there's still measurements that can happen across the map that might mean that even though the champion's fed, the way they compare to the overall team composition might be weak. And so it means that they're still manageable, and because Riot has continued to add these comeback mechanics, as well as acceleration mechanics such as plates, there's new ways of battling things, and there's new ways of taking things on. And all of a sudden, things become much more razor edge, rather than playing simply not to lose lane, because it's so easy not to lose lane when you're playing with champions that are gimped, champions that take longer to do all these things, champions that take longer to wind up, champions that have less potency with their jungler, and champions that just naturally can't offer as much bang for their buck as in the past. Even when you had Jace being really, really strong in top lane, I already mentioned this, Victor and Ryze could contain him. There were other champions that could also go up against Jace. Even when Ryze was really strong, he also contained Vladimir. He contained several other champions up in top lane that couldn't really go up against him. But there were champions that beat Ryze, which were the super tanks. The super tanks could actually take it to Ryze. Mages that outranged him could take it to Ryze up in top lane. And so suddenly, if Ryze can't just say, oh, I picked Ryze, good luck, you can't pick Jace, and there's nothing to beat me because everything's too weak, and he puffs his chest, yeah, Ryze sucks. If you blind pick Ryze and then someone meets you with the super tank, well, now it's going to be, what's the jungler pick? And the teams both select their junglers. Well, now how do they match up in the 2v2, but also how do they match up in the 3v3? How do they match up at 15 minutes, 25 minutes? Now there's more questions that start coming in, and thus strategy is able to be explored more, and the game has more explosiveness available to it, even though the counter matchup is truly a counter matchup, whereas in today's state, counter matchups, if you look at them in pro play, it's never really that gross. Even something that's considered a hard counter is able to be pretty easily managed with jungler presence or just intelligently playing out the lane, because the damage on champions is just lower. And the plate acceleration is sort of mitigated to an extent by the comeback gold and the comeback XP. There's even been threads on Reddit about this. So, then if the super tanks end up arriving to contain Ryze, then there's champions that can beat the super tanks so long as they're buffed. Champions like Shen can actually do really good against the super tanks. Gangplank can do really good against the super tanks. Champions like Gnar can do really good against the super tanks. Lucian, Vayne, all of these champions can then contain the super champs, or the super tanks. Up in top lane, even if the super tanks are only meant to contain certain champions. So now you have a very big pool with a lot of flexibility. In trading card games, most notably Magic the Gathering, a lot of people will refer to certain block sets where the draft formats are really exciting due to the possibility of all the different deck variations and how strong those decks can be if you get the pieces to them. And what I mean by that is sometimes blocks in Magic end up coming out, and for those that don't play Magic the Gathering, there's only 5 colors in Magic: red, green, white, blue, and black. Each color represents a fundamental theory of the game, whether it be controlling nature or just going face like Tryndamere, controlling nature being maybe something like Azir or Orianna, white being sort of very flexible and able to do several things, perhaps like a Gragas, a green, bluish type of champion, maybe like an Ivern, and then a black champion would be something that sacrifices things in order to gain elsewhere, and maybe a champion like that would be Karthus, perhaps, inside of the jungle. Maybe Karthus is like black and blue, where he sacrifices early dueling potential, at least in the jungle, and he gives it up for very fast scaling, very fast jungle clearing, and a ramp into the later game, even if he's fragile early on. We can see this type of archetypes extend into many different types of champions in League. And when you start viewing the pick ban, as well as champions, like maybe colors in Magic the Gathering, you'll start to realize that there tends to just be a few colors that are really good, and then every other color is not good. This leads to really bland metas where it ends up coming down to who got the better colors, or is it going to be the same colors facing off against one another, and then it's sort of boring, and who just gets the better edge after a long enough period of time. And that's not really exciting. What is exciting is sitting down with an opponent and you can have black-blue go up against red-green, you can have black-blue go up against white-green, you can have black-blue go up against blue-green, and you have, or blue-red, and you have all these different answers and options available to you, and they're all strong. And they all come with their own unique traits that may be what side of the map they're on, such as if you're on red side, obviously champions with long range are very good at stalling Baron. If you're on blue side, champions on the blue side are very good at turtling their blue side jungle and denying Baron, rather than just outright stalling it via the poke inside of the pit if the blue team were to try to take it. These types of things can develop team compositions that are better catered towards certain parts of the map. Likewise, you can draft certain team compositions that maybe they want Elder Dragon. And if they want Elder Dragon, then they want a lot of power in the jungle, mid lane, and bot lane so that they can capture all of the elemental drakes to eventually bolster their Elder Dragon power. And then because maybe a team can realize this midway through the draft, they recalibrate their draft in order to match or answer that type of a strategy. And then even if you get somewhat similar team compositions fighting off against one another, there's more explosiveness behind it, and there's likely more volatility because someone responded to the other rather than just agreeing that everything sucks. So because of this, it ends up bringing it full circle, where the meta right now, I've talked with so many people, and even when I cast LCK or when I watch highlights of other regions, it's really, really, really boring. It's not fun to see Corki and Azir smack each other in mid lane. It's not fun to see the same junglers almost incapable of doing anything unless they perhaps, path around a ward, they get a gank, or their laners manipulate the lane, which is including player skill to an extent. But even when these leads are obtained, go and look at a lot of the leads that can be obtained and what ends up following suit, and then also look at how the games really blow open after those leads are obtained. And you'll notice that a lot of it is someone slips up, which mistakes happen. Yes, they do occur, but did the mistake have to occur, and did those safe champions have other options that existed? And if the answer is yes, then there ends up becoming a problem, because it means that the champions that are really far ahead simply just don't have enough resources to do something else. And then this segues into my point about freezing, but then that would be an entirely different video that I plan to do at a later date. So now what I'm thinking is that champions are just picked because they don't suck, not because they're necessarily good. And this is a fundamental problem where suddenly garbage champions are objectively okay. And if this ends up happening, the boring lanes stall and don't lose, and 15-20 minutes ends up coming by and nothing happens, unless the players are better than their opponents. And if the players are better than their opponents, or if the players are taking risks or gambles, then maybe some fireworks can fly, but it doesn't change that the fundamental lanes are still problematic. So for instance, right now Corki and Azir are in the current meta. Sometimes there's deviations in mid lane. We've seen Veigar actually pop up to answer Azir when Azir wants to be blinded. We've seen people try to pinch out Corki and then pick Azir. We've seen Corki picked and then a pinch to Azir, thinking that, well, these are just the best champions, even if they don't tend to have as many options and power, like I've alluded to before. If you think about some of the strongest champions in history in League of Legends, if you think about Release Camille, if you think about pre-nerfs Karthus, if you think about Nidalee and Graves in Season 6, if you think about Red Smite, if you think about Elise when she used to be really, really powerful, if you think about Quinn up in top lane, Ryze when he was really, really strong, Jace when he was much stronger, Gangplank when he was stronger, other AD carries like Lucian being very strong, or champions like Kog'Maw being strong, etc., and you throw all of them at each other, in their own way, they contain themselves. And if the players end up slipping up and these really strong champions get advantages, they're able to do a little bit more with it. But because the tools that Riot has put in place for comeback mechanics and whatnot, the game state is still able to be salvaged. And then because the drafts by nature are able to be more volatile because enough bans don't exist, then you get a lot of creativity. But right now, it feels really easy to pinch certain things from existing inside of the ban phase. In a pretty weird way, there's just too many bans. And that's a byproduct of, again, champions don't do enough. So if there's too many bans, or if you say that there's not enough bans because you want to be able to pinch even more, it still doesn't change the main thing, is that if you want to pinch even more, you're looking for an even larger edge in an already slow and stale game state. You're just looking to make it so that your really slow and stale champion is able to get a slightly larger edge, which is sort of like what Corki tries to achieve when he bans out Azir. Or it's sort of like what Jace tries to achieve when he bans out the champions that can maybe resist him. Or what Gangplank tries to achieve when he bans out the champions that can resist him. When these strong champions are able to just allocate a couple of bans and basically have their butts covered, something is wrong. There should be more fear for these champions than what currently exists. And when all of the patches just keep nerfing and nerfing, or they do these slight buffs that aren't really all that meaningful, it gets a little bit concerning. A lot of people say that when I do my patch rundowns or when I talk about stuff like this, that I think that the game should only be balanced for high MMR. And to that, I've always said that, well, that's not entirely true. I just think that there's different ways to balance the champions that isn't outright nerfing them. For instance, Mordekaiser got hit recently. He lost a lot of his damage, even though I personally think Mordekaiser was really weak. Obviously, his win rate inside of solo queue would disagree with that, and that leads people to get angry with me if I say that he's weak. The reality of the situation is that at the very high-end MMR, he is weak. So if he loses even more of these numbers, he's doomed to not be viable. There's things that you can do to make Mordekaiser viable by changing his kit. You could maybe make the speed of his E come out a lot faster. This means that even if the damage is missing, his damage is more consistent and it's more reliable. It adds utility to him that he doesn't currently have against high-level players, and if the utility is there, perhaps it augments or it changes his itemization to enhance his build. If you perhaps do something with his Death Realm that makes it more skillful or produces a higher reward to him, then that also helps him a little bit more. Perhaps you can actually take away some of his stats if you make his Death Realm more rewarding if he ends up hitting it, in addition to the E. There's always going to be ways to outright change champions without just making them super bad in pro play. You can look at what is making them really strong and low MMR, and then you can change it. For instance, one of the most gross examples of this is adding skill shots. Imagine me recommending Annie if all of Annie's skill shots, or if all of Annie's abilities, most notably her Q, were a skill shot, or if Tibbers was actually harder to hit. If perhaps Tibbers had to throw a projectile, land, and then summon the bear. Now suddenly Annie isn't really all that easy, and now because she's harder, you can actually change or enhance some of her numbers to make up for this difficulty. And then you can assess and then tune back based on what is happening at pro play now that you've fundamentally made the champion more difficult. Obviously, I've had many talks with people on the balance team, most notably Jat and historically Maple Nectar, and they're both awesome people. And I've had extensive talks with both of them, and I get what they're saying, and I understand it. And it does make sense when it is just sort of broken down why stuff is happening the way that it is for the way that balance happens. But then my question has always been, well, there's the silent majority, which is something that I've brought up with several writers. How does one account for the silent majority? Because sometimes we see changes occur due to the loud minority. So then why is the silent majority not considered in those situations? But then in addition to that, how do we know what the silent majority actually feels? And why has there never been experimentation with buffing champions? And obviously, the response to this has been that when the game gets chaotic, the pro players don't really like it. Well, that's what preseason's for. Preseason is the time where pro players' jobs are not on the line. They're not fighting for victories and wins and points and playoff standings. And so preseason, or anything even during Worlds in terms of solo queue, can be used to test the waters on such things. Even mid-game balance patches, if it's given enough notice, you can drop bombs, which is something that I've always alluded to in the past, which is something that I've always been excited about whenever Riot's done it historically in a patch. They've dropped a champion into the meta that ends up shaping the meta around them ever so slightly due to how strong they are. Now imagine if that happens with several champions. The meta will get a little bit chaotic for a while, but then it will eventually settle down. Has anyone noticed that some of the Riven threads have disappeared? Complaints about Riven sort of disappeared. Zoe is actually worse now than she was before, but pro players think that Zoe is more of a menace now due to people got more experience with playing her, and people got more experience with playing around her as a team. And sometimes this happens. If you allow something to exist long enough, natural answers or natural solutions can end up popping up to answer or remedy things naturally, and things can be sifted out of the meta. One of the largest examples of this is actually Rek'Sai. I remember being harped on because I said Rek'Sai still sucks during the patch rundown. And what I was seeing is 2 to 3 months from now, people get accustomed to playing around Rek'Sai's paths again. They get accustomed to Rek'Sai's clear speed. They get accustomed to playing around Rek'Sai's engages in the mid to late game. They get accustomed to relearning how to 2v2 and 3v3 against Rek'Sai and play around the routes where Rek'Sai's looking for these things. And then as a byproduct to that, Rek'Sai also arrived as an answer to some champions, most notably the AD champions. Rek'Sai begins to fall out. And so at the time, I get a lot of flame and a lot of people criticize my comment about Rek'Sai, even though I personally picked Rek'Sai at certain points, and Rek'Sai was dominating solo queue at certain points. It doesn't change that Rek'Sai still sucks. She still sucks. She's still bad, even if she has tools in her kit that can beat worse players, or she can be very pub stompy. There's also champions that are still objectively bad that are objectively strong in solo queue if in the hands of a pro player. Something like Kha'Zix is an example of this. Something like Evelynn is an example of this, where Evelynn can't be picked unless the stars basically align, and most people don't realize that. Evelynn is very weak to an abundance of champions that can be present inside of a team composition. I remember trying to draft for Malice and talking about Evelynn's spots with Malice, and for those that don't know, Malice is a Evelynn connoisseur, and Evelynn is probably his most played champion. We did utilize her in pro play several times, even in a match where she was a bad pick. And because of that, Evelynn, he would basically say, I can't play her if Galio's in the game. Can't play her if Morgana's in the game. I can't play her if Thresh is in the game. I can't play her if Karma's in the game. I can't play her if that's the ADC. I can't play her if that's the jungle. I can't play her if that's the top laner. And just these one champion being present in the draft list suddenly makes him think, well, I just can't even pick her. Suddenly, a champion that might not even be that strong has contained a champion. And Evelynn, I think she's pretty good, but I don't think that she's busted, but I do think that she could be researched more. Anyways, bringing this all full cycle, I'm afraid of the world's meta. And what I mean by that is I remember last summer. And last summer was very, very boring. Last summer was very, very bland. It was like a hot, dry desert watching the little thing, you know what I mean? The gust of wind that blows it. That's what it felt like in solo queue. It was the same champions over and over and over. It was the same bans, and everything sucked, except for Camille and Xin and Zoe and Aurelia and very, very few champions. Why is it that only a few champions are always standing out? League of Legends has over 100 champions. why is it that only a handful stand out as being scary? And then why does everyone else have to succumb to those few? Even if we've had the most picks, I believe, this season in pro play of all the champions in the game, I don't think that that is an argument against the things that I'm bringing up about champions returning. For instance, Camille is coming back to the top lane. What? That doesn't make any sense. Why? How? How is she allowed to exist after everything that's happened? But then in addition to that, we've learned that despite these nerfs, Camille players have gotten so much better, they've learned to play around the things that made Camille have problems before. Despite all of the nerfs and things that were thrown Camille's way, as well as whatever the current state of the meta is that she might be facing. Why is Gnar getting picked up? Why are players just now beginning to experiment with moving really weird champions around, like sending Azir top lane? Why is flexing not done more in order to punish some of the things that I brought up? We can talk about how maybe some of this is a pro team problem, but I think realistically it is a champion problem. And I would like a lot more if champions had to be afraid of more than just 2 to 3 champions at max, and they would have to really be more considerate of where they would want to get picked inside of a draft order. For instance, I don't even think Sona Taric was that OP. In fact, Taric ended up being sort of removed as the support for Sona as time drew on because people thought that she was better with different supports and different playstyles. And that's sort of a natural remedy. And even though Sona ends up getting hit, did she need to? Or could the champions that made her suffer just simply be buffed, and then maybe people are afraid to pick Sona, rather than playing the do-si-do and the pick ban, where someone can pick Taric, and then do you pick Sona X, or does the person pick Sona and you pick Taric, or does the red team just get Sona Taric, etc.? Anyways, that's pretty much it for the LS logic. I just wanted to have a conversation about this because I think I don't enjoy watching the meta as it is and watching how binary it is. And I know that a lot of people think that the meta is really good right now, and I disagree because I think that people aren't looking at how much better it could be, and I think that people have grown content with what they have because it seems stable, but I think it's the wrong kind of stable. I think it can be a lot better than this, and I think it can be a lot more explosive with a lot more fun that doesn't require super, super explosive changes across every single champion in the game or runes or whatnot, but rather make champions afraid of each other. Kled will make Aatrox afraid, even though Aatrox just got buffed. Let's make another champion make Aatrox afraid. Suddenly, he's not the bully anymore. Suddenly, he has to be conscious of when he wants to step into the light. That's pretty much it, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this LS logic. I'll be making another video, actually, on a topic that I brought up in this video, which was the freezing of lanes, and how that's something that we're not seeing really anyone do. Thanks.